She was never supposed to be behind that velvet curtain. Not in a room where the air smelled like expensive cigars and ancient, dangerous secrets. Not at a table where a single signature could erase a man's legacy, or his life. But when 7-year-old Lynn E. Avilla heard the translator speak, her heart stopped. The dissonance reveal. Because the words he said in Korean were not the words he said in English. And the man sitting at the head of that table? He wasn't just a businessman. He was Cha Kwang, the most feared name in the Korean underworld. And in a world built on power, one mistranslated word isn't a mistake. It's an assassination. The engagement pivot. Before we go any further, if you saw a monster about to walk into a fatal trap, would you stay quiet to save yourself, or risk it all to warn him? Drop a comment right now, stay quiet or speak up. Keep that answer in mind. Because what this little girl whispered next, didn't just save a life. It started a war. The Gilded Lily was more than a restaurant, it was a sanctuary for men who didn't want to be found. Deep mahogany walls. Thick carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps. In the center of the private suite sat a contract, open on the table like a trap waiting to snap shut. Cha Kwang sat perfectly still, tattooed, serious, a man who spoke with his eyes because his voice usually meant someone was about to disappear. The villainous competence beats. Across from him, the translator looked like a saint in a sharp suit. Clean cut. Smooth. Professional. He was a snake who knew that the most effective weapon isn't a gun, it's a lie told in a language the victim doesn't understand. He was rewriting the terms of a territory deal in real time. Removing a warning here. Adding a surrender clause there. He thought he was the only one in the room who knew two truths. The protagonist reveal. But tucked into the shadows of the hallway was Lynn. A small girl with a worn-out linguistics textbook and ears that had spent a lifetime learning how to listen. To the men at the table, she was just background noise. The waitress's niece. A child who didn't matter. But as Lynn watched the businessman's hand reach for his pen, she realized the translator wasn't just lying. He was digging a grave. The ticking clock escalation. The pen touched the paper. The air in the room grew heavy. Lynn knew that if she stayed silent, she was safe. But if she spoke, she was stepping into the middle of a mafia execution. She took a breath, stepped out from behind the curtain, and walked straight toward the man with the tattoos. The little translator was about to speak. Lynn E. Avilla knew the exact weight of a secret. At 7 years old, she was small for her age, a blessing when your entire existence depended on occupying as little space as possible. While the other children in her apartment complex spent their evenings chasing shadows under the flickering streetlights of Atlanta, Lynn spent hers in the service hallway of the Gilded Lily. The hallway smelled of floor wax and expensive sea base, a sharp contrast to the damp, cramped apartment she shared with her Aunt Dorothy. Here, tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of dust and old money, Lynn sat on an upturned milk crate. In her lap was a worn, spine-cracked textbook on advanced linguistics, salvaged from a library discard pile. To Lynn, languages weren't just subjects in a book, they were puzzles, each one a different key that could unlock a world far better than the one she currently inhabited. Lynn. You back there? The curtain rustled, and Aunt Dorothy leaned in, her forehead glistening with the sweat of a double shift. She reached out and smoothed Lynn's hair, her eyes darting toward the swinging kitchen doors with a flicker of habitual anxiety. I'm here, Auntie, Lynn whispered, her voice barely a ripple. Remember what I told you, Dorothy said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent rasp. The manager is in a mood tonight. Some big-shot investors are in the private suite. You stay behind this curtain. You don't make a sound. You don't even breathe loud enough to disturb the air. In a place like this, a girl like you is supposed to be a ghost. You understand me? If they don't see you, they can't hurt you. Never be noticed, Lynn recited. It was the first commandment of their survival. That's my girl, Dorothy sighed, pressing a small, cold piece of bread into Lynn's hand, a leftover from a breadbasket, before disappearing back into the chaos of the dinner rush. Lynn watched her go, then turned her attention back to her book. She practiced the shapes of foreign vowels in the back of her throat, silent and precise. She loved the way Korean felt, the logic of its structure, the honorifics that dictated the distance between people. It was a language of respect, something she rarely felt from the world around her. She was halfway through a chapter on dialect nuances when the air in the hallway seemed to thicken. The temperature didn't drop, but a sudden, heavy silence drifted from the private dining suite just 10 feet away. Usually, these rooms were filled with the loud, booming laughter of men who owned the city. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that preceded a storm. Through the thin gap in the velvet curtains, Lynn saw the silhouettes of the men inside. One stood out, a broad-shouldered man in a black suit, his posture as rigid as a tombstone. Even from the shadows, she could see the dark, intricate ink of a tattoo creeping up the side of his neck, disappearing under a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. Lynn closed her book slowly, her fingers trembling slightly against the cover. She knew she should retreat further into the dark, to become the ghost her aunt required. But then, a voice rose from the room, smooth, oily, and confident. It was the translator, speaking in English, and then in Korean. Lynn's breath hitched. Her mind, sharpened by months of solitary study, processed the words faster than her fear could stop them. The English words were a promise of partnership. But the Korean words? They were a death sentence. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was the only person in the building who knew that a murder was being negotiated over appetizers. The shift wasn't loud, it was heavy. It was the kind of silence that didn't just happen, it was commanded. One moment, the gilded lily was a symphony of clinking silver and the distant hum of jazz, the next, it was a vacuum. Even the air behind Lynn's velvet curtain seemed to hold its breath. Then came the footsteps. They weren't hurried or aggressive, they were rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of a man who owned every inch of the floor he walked upon. Lynn pressed her face against the gap in the fabric, her eyes widening as the entourage moved past. At the center was Cha Kwang. He was a mountain of tailored wool and cold intention. In the dim, amber glow of the restaurant sconces, he looked less like a businessman and more like a monarch returning to a conquered territory. He moved with a predatory grace that made the two men flanking him look like mere shadows. But it was his skin that held Lynn captive. As he turned his head, the light caught the intricate, dark ink that climbed his neck, a dragon's tail, perhaps, or a rising tide. Disappearing into the sharp line of his hair. It was a warning written in permanent ink, a map of a life lived in the places most people were too afraid to look. The restaurant manager, a man who usually carried himself with the inflated ego of a minor king, was suddenly bowing so low he looked like he might snap in half. No words were exchanged. Kwang didn't need to speak, his presence was its own dialect. He moved toward the private suite, his eyes scanning the room with a terrifying, basalt-colored neutrality. For a split second, those eyes flicked toward the velvet curtain. Lynn froze. She felt the ancient, primal urge to disappear, to melt into the brickwork as Aunt Dorothy had taught her. She clutched her linguistics book to her chest, the hard corners digging into her ribs. She was a ghost, she reminded herself. Invisible. Background noise. But as Kwang entered the suite and the heavy mahogany doors began to groan shut, Lynn caught a glimpse of his face in the light of the private room. He looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a long day, but the weariness of a man who lived in a world where everyone was always waiting for him to bleed. The door clicked shut, sealing the king inside with his enemies and a translator who was already sharpening his tongue like a blade. The restaurant resumed its noise, but the vibration had changed. The jazz sounded frantic now, and the laughter of the other diners felt thin and brittle. Lynn looked down at her book, specifically at the section on Korean honorifics. She thought about the word Wang, king. In her books, kings were protected by walls and knights. But in that room, the only thing standing between Cha Kwang and a catastrophic betrayal was a thin layer of frosted glass and a little girl who was never supposed to be noticed. The silence in the hallway felt different now. It didn't feel like safety, it felt like a countdown. The heavy mahogany doors didn't just block the light, they seemed to swallow the warmth of the hallway, leaving Lynn in a cold, electric silence. She adjusted her position, pressing her ear against the narrow gap where the door met the frame. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedarwood and the sharp, metallic tang of a deal about to be struck. Cha Kwang spoke first. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that felt like a vibration in the floorboards. He spoke in formal, old-school Korean, the kind Lynn had only seen in the most advanced sections of her textbooks. It was the language of a man who valued tradition, a man who expected his words to be treated with the same weight as the ink on his skin. "I am offering my protection to your southern shipping routes," Kwang said, his tone flat and unyielding. "But I do not share my house. The ports remain under my flag. Is that understood?" Across the table, the Western businessman sat forward, his eyes darting to the translator. The translator, a man named Marcus with a smile that never reached his eyes, didn't hesitate. He leaned in, his voice shifting into a smooth, buttery English that sounded like a lullaby. "Mr. Cha says he is incredibly honored by your proposal," Marcus translated, his tone warm and accommodating. "He is eager to collaborate and is willing to be flexible on the jurisdictional boundaries of the ports to ensure a long and prosperous partnership." Lynn's fingers dug into the cover of her book. That's not what he said, she thought, her heart beginning to drum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The businessman nodded, a smug grin spreading across his face. He replied in English, a rapid-fire series of technical demands about logistics and insurance. Then, Marcus turned back to Kwang. But he didn't translate the technicalities. Instead, he softened his voice, adopting a posture of exaggerated deference that made Kwang look like a god among men. "He says he is humbled by your power, boss," Marcus said in Korean. "He says the Western markets are already whispering your name in fear. He believes you are the only man capable of ruling the coast, and he is ready to sign whatever you put in front of him out of pure respect." Lynn felt a cold sweat break out across her brow. The translator was playing a dangerous game of psychological mirrors. To the American, he was making Kwang look like a pushover ready to give up his territory. To Kwang, he was painting the American as a worshipper, inflating the mafia boss's ego to blind him to the legal trap being laid on the table. He was stripping away the warnings and replacing them with a hollow, golden praise. Every time Kwang asked a sharp, tactical question, Marcus smoothed it over with a layer of professional grease. He was building a bridge of lies, and Kwang, used to being the most feared person in the room, was leaning into the comfort of the false flattery. He didn't see the snake narrowing his eyes every time Kwang looked away. Lynn looked down at her small, trembling hands. She remembered Aunt Dorothy's voice, "A girl like you is supposed to be a ghost." But as she heard the rustle of the contract being slid across the mahogany table, she realized that ghosts didn't just haunt rooms. They witnessed the things the living were too blind to see. If she stayed a ghost, the king would fall. And if the king fell, the snake would be the one holding the crown. The mahogany room had become a pressure cooker of unspoken intent. Inside, the businessman, a man whose name Lynn hadn't even heard, reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit. He didn't pull out a weapon, but something that felt much heavier. A fountain pen, sleek and silver, glinting under the chandelier like a sharpened tooth. Lynn watched through the sliver of the doorway, her eyes fixed not on the pen, but on the hand that held it. The man was smiling, his face a mask of corporate confidence, but his fingers were betraying him. They were trembling, a fine, rhythmic shudder that made the silver pen dance against the white tablecloth. It wasn't the tremor of a man nervous about a deal. It was the frantic vibration of someone standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the signal to jump. Across from him, Cha Kwang remained a statue of ink and iron. He looked down at the contract, his large, tattooed hand hovering near the signature line. He looked satisfied, his ego fed by the translator's poisonous praise. Marcus, the snake, leaned in closer, his eyes darting between the pen and Kwang's hand, his breathing shallow and expectant. Lynn's gaze drifted back to the businessman. He wasn't looking at the contract anymore. He was staring at the heavy doors of the suite, his knuckles white as he gripped the pen. Then, she saw it, the subtle shift. He didn't just hold the pen, he clicked the cap into place with a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed like a hammer falling on a firing pin. In that moment, the linguistics of the room changed. It was no longer a negotiation, it was an execution. Lynn realized with a jolt of pure ice in her veins that the pen wasn't for signing. It was a signal. The moment Kwang's head went down to sign that paper, the doors would burst open, or the snake would strike, or a hidden threat would emerge from the shadows of the balcony. The contract was the bait, the pen was the trigger, and the translator was the one who had led the lion into the cage. The silence in the hallway felt like a physical weight pressing against Lynn's chest. She looked at her book, then back at the man who was about to be destroyed because he believed a lie. She thought of Aunt Dorothy's warning, if they don't see you, they can't hurt you. But if she stayed unseen, she would be a silent witness to a slaughter. The businessman moved the pen toward Kwang, an invitation for the boss to take it. The snake smiled, a thin, predatory curve of the lips. The air was screaming, but the room was silent. Lynn felt the textbook slip from her fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. She didn't pick it up. She didn't retreat. Instead, she reached out and pushed the velvet curtain aside, her small shadow stretching long across the floor of the private suite. She was done being a ghost. The king was about to sign his own death warrant, and she was the only one in the world who could hear the trap snapping shut. The silence of the room was a fragile glass dome, and Lynn's first step shattered it. She moved with a purpose that defied her 7 years, her small sneakers making no sound on the plush Persian rug. To the guards flanking the door, she was a momentary glitch in the peripheral, a child who had surely lost her way, but by the time they realized she wasn't stopping, she was already deep within the lion's den. One guard reached out, a gloved hand descending like a hawk, but Lynn ducked beneath his shadow with the fluid grace of a girl who spent her life navigating cramped hallways. She didn't look at the businessman, whose hand froze mid-air with the silver pen. She didn't look at Marcus, the snake, whose smooth face finally cracked into a mask of pure, indignant shock. She looked only at the man with the dragon on his neck. Cha Kwang didn't move as she approached. He sat like a mountain, his dark eyes tracking the small figure until she was standing directly at his shoulder. The air around him was cold, smelling of expensive tobacco and the weight of 1,000 hard decisions. The guards closed in, their voices rising in a sharp command to seize her, but Kwang raised one tattooed hand. It was a small gesture, but the room went deathly still. Lynn stood on her tiptoes. She was so close she could see the individual ink strokes of the dragon's scales on his skin. She leaned in, her small hand cupping her mouth as if she were sharing a playground secret, but the words that left her lips were sharp, formal, and devastatingly accurate. "Your translator is lying," she whispered in perfect, high-register Korean. Kwang's posture didn't change, but his eyes narrowed to obsidian slits. Lynn didn't stop. The words poured out of her, a flood of truth she had been holding back since she first heard the snake speak. The Englishman did not offer respect, she continued, her voice a steady vibration against the mafia boss's ear. He offered a threat. The contract does not give you the southern routes, it surrenders your harbor to his men. And the pen in his hand? It is not for a signature. It is the signal for the men outside the door to enter once your head is turned. The businessman's face drained of color. He didn't understand the Korean words, but he understood the shift in the atmosphere. The snake began to stammer, his polished facade crumbling into a heap of desperate excuses. "Boss, I don't know who this child is, she's just a waitress's relative, she's babbling nonsense." Marcus's voice climbed an octave, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. Kwang finally turned his head. He didn't look at the translator. He didn't look at the businessman. He looked directly at Lynn. For the first time, the king really saw her. He saw the worn textbook she had left in the hallway. He saw the intelligence burning in her eyes, a fire that had been forged in the shadows. "Is that so?" Kwang asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr that made the windows rattle in their frames. He reached out and took the silver pen from the businessman's trembling fingers. He didn't sign the paper. Instead, he snapped the pen in half with a single, effortless motion. Black ink bled across the white tablecloth, spreading like a dark omen. Lynn didn't flinch. She stood her ground at the right hand of the most dangerous man in the city, the ghost who had finally decided to haunt the living. The trap had been exposed, and for the first time in his life, Cha Kwang wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking at the little girl who had just become his shield. The broken pen lay on the table like a corpse, its ink weeping into the expensive white linen. The silence that followed was more than a lack of sound, it was a physical pressure, the kind that precedes the shattering of a foundation. Cha Kwang did not look at the translator, whose face was now the color of wet ash. He kept his obsidian gaze fixed on Lynn, his expression unreadable, a stone mask carved from a lifetime of shadows. "You speak the language of my home," Kwang said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the crystal glasses on the table hum. He didn't use the tone of a master to a servant, but rather a curious predator to a miracle. "Tell me, little one." The last thing he said, the sentence about the southern routes. Translated exactly as it was meant to be heard. The room held its breath. Marcus, the snake, made a small, choked sound in his throat, a pathetic whimper of a man who realized his golden tongue had finally been cut out. Lynn didn't look at him. She didn't look at the American businessman, who was now halfway out of his chair, his eyes darting toward the frosted glass doors. She looked at the dragon on Kwang's neck and spoke. Her voice was small but as sharp as a diamond. He did not say he was honored. He said, "The old man is blind with his own pride. By the time he realizes the ports are ours, he will already be under the water." The glass didn't just shatter, it exploded. Kwang's hand, the one that had just snapped the pen, moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for the table, flipping the heavy mahogany surface with a roar of pure, unleashed fury. Plates of untouched appetizers and crystal flutes of champagne cascaded onto the floor, the sound of breaking glass echoing like gunfire. "Kill the lights," someone screamed. The businessman didn't wait. He dove for the exit, but the doors burst open before he could reach them. Not from the outside, but from the force of Kwang's own men reacting to the signal of the table's crash. The snake tried to bolt, but a heavy hand caught him by the collar, dragging him backward into the chaos. Shouts erupted from the main dining floor. The jazz music stopped abruptly, replaced by the screams of wealthy patrons and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the carpet. In the center of the hurricane stood Kwang. He didn't move. He stood over the wreckage of the deal, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying light. Aunt Dorothy's voice echoed in Lynn's head, "If they don't see you, they can't hurt you," but it was too late for invisibility. A stray glass shard sliced through the air, and the room was a blur of black suits and rising violence. Lynn felt a hand seize her shoulder. It wasn't the rough grip of a guard or the desperate reach of the businessman. It was Kwang. His large, tattooed hand shielded her from the debris, pulling her into the solid, immovable shadow of his body. He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the terrifying king was gone. In his eyes was a flicker of something Lynn had never seen in a stranger, recognition. "Stay behind me," he commanded. The gilded lily was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield. But as the world tore itself apart around them, Lynn realized she wasn't afraid. She had broken the silence, and in return, the king had given her his shadow. The little girl who was never supposed to be noticed had just set the world on fire. The dust of the scuffle began to settle, though the air in the Gilded Lily remained thick with the smell of ozone and spilled iron. In the main dining room, the chaos was being efficiently stifled by Kwang's men, but the private suite was a wreckage of broken mahogany and shattered pride. Amidst the ruins, a new sound cut through the silence, the frantic, high-pitched clicking of heels on the hardwood floor. Gerald, the restaurant manager, burst through the doors, his face a mottled purple of rage and sheer panic. He didn't look at the overturned table or the blood on the floor, his eyes locked onto Aunt Dorothy, who stood trembling by the service entrance, her apron stained and her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. "You!" Gerald screamed, his fingers shaking as he pointed at her. "I told you that brat was a liability. I told you to keep your trash in the shadows. Look at this. Look at my restaurant. You're finished, Dorothy. You and that little freak are out on the street tonight. Don't bother coming back for your check, the damages here will cost more than you'll earn in 3 lifetimes." Dorothy crumbled, her shoulders heaving as she began to sob, the sound of a woman who had just seen her only bridge to survival burn to the ground. She reached out for Lynn, her eyes begging for the invisibility they had lost. But before Gerald could take another step, a shadow moved. Cha Kwang stepped forward, the movement so fluid and menacing that Gerald's voice died in his throat. The manager looked up, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't yelling at a waitress, he was interrupting a god. Kwang didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply placed a heavy, tattooed hand on Gerald's shoulder. The manager's knees visibly buckled. "The woman stays," Kwang said. His voice was a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards Gerald stood on. "And the child?" He paused, his gaze shifting to Lynn, who stood small but unshaken by his side. "The child is the only reason you still have a head to scream with. If she had stayed silent, your restaurant would have been the site of a massacre tonight. My blood would have stained these floors, and my brothers would have burned this building to the ground to find the men responsible." Gerald's mouth hung open, his face draining of all color until he looked like the very ghosts Lynn had tried to emulate. Kwang turned away from him, dismissing the man as if he were a bothersome insect. He looked at Dorothy, his expression softening into something unreadable but firm. "Your niece," he said, switching to English so she could understand. "She is not trash. She is a gift from the heavens. She has a tongue that speaks truth and ears that hear the wind. She has saved more than a deal tonight. She has saved a lineage." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed card, pressing it into Dorothy's hand. "Go home. Take the girl. My men will escort you. You no longer work for men like this," he flicked a glance at the cowering Gerald. "You work for me now." Lynn looked up at Kwang. The king didn't look terrifying anymore. In the dim, flickering light of the ruined room, he looked like a man who had finally found something he didn't have to fight to keep. He reached down and briefly touched the top of Lynn's head, a gesture of benediction. "You have a voice, Lynn E. Avilla," he whispered in Korean, the words for her ears only. "Never let them make you a ghost again." As they were led out through the back, past the wide-eyed staff and the retreating sirens, Lynn felt the weight of the textbook in her bag. She realized then that languages weren't just puzzles to solve. They were the bridge between being nothing and being everything. The shadows were gone. The light was just beginning to find her. The transition from the cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood to the reinforced steel and glass of Cha Kwang's headquarters felt like crossing into another dimension. The building was a monolith of black stone tucked away in an industrial district where the city's noise went to die. Inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and heavy with the scent of ozone and expensive espresso. Lynn walked down the long, minimalist corridors with her hand tucked into Aunt Dorothy's. Her aunt was silent, her eyes wide as she took in the security details, men with earpieces and tactical holsters who stood like statues at every corner. These were the monsters the world whispered about, the shadows that kept the city's elite awake at night. But as Lynn passed them, she didn't feel the cold prickle of fear. She felt a strange, quiet clarity. She realized that while these men held guns, they were often deaf to the nuances of the very air they breathed. They were ushered into a room that overlooked the city, a vast office where Cha Kwang sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. He didn't look up immediately. He was listening to a man in a gray suit who was speaking rapidly in a dialect of Japanese that was rough and laden with slang. The man in the gray suit was gesturing toward a map, his tone subservient but his eyes darting toward a ledger on the desk. Kwang nodded, his face unreadable, his tattooed fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the stone. "Wait here," Dorothy whispered, her voice trembling. But Kwang's eyes flicked up, finding Lynn instantly. He didn't look at the aunt. He looked at the child. He made a small motion with his chin, inviting her closer. Lynn walked to the edge of the obsidian desk. She listened to the man in the gray suit for 3 minutes. She heard the way his voice hitched when he mentioned the shipment dates. She heard the specific choice of words he used to describe his losses, words that suggested the money hadn't been lost, but merely moved. When the man finished, Kwang looked at Lynn. The room was silent, the air vibrating with the weight of his expectation. "Is he telling the truth, little advisor?" Kwang asked in Korean. Lynn didn't hesitate. She had spent her life being invisible, which meant she had spent her life becoming an expert in the things people said when they thought no one was listening. She looked at the man in the gray suit, who was now staring at her with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "He uses the word for misfortune," Lynn said, her voice steady and clear in the large room. "But the dialect he uses is from the docks in Osaka. In that place, that specific word is only used when a person is hiding a winning hand in a game of cards. He is not sad about the loss, boss. He is proud of the theft." The man in the gray suit turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Kwang's tapping fingers stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Kwang leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He didn't need to check the ledger. He didn't need to call for an audit. He had the only tool that mattered, a translator who couldn't be bought because she was too young to know the value of greed, and too brilliant to be fooled by a lie. "You see," Kwang said to the room at large, though his eyes remained on Lynn. "The world is full of people who think silence is a weakness. They think a child is just background noise." He opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound book, not a linguistics text this time, but a heavy, blank journal with cream-colored pages and a silver pen that didn't hide a signal. He pushed it across the obsidian toward her. "From now on, you sit in the room," Kwang commanded. "You listen. And you tell me when the air starts to smell like a lie." Lynn took the book. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the youngest advisor to the most dangerous man in the city, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the monsters. She was the one who could hear them coming. The transition was finalized not with a contract, but with the quiet click of a heavy door closing behind them. For the first time in Lynn's life, the air she breathed didn't taste of dust or anxiety. Their new home was a sun-drenched apartment on the quiet side of the city, provided by the Han Wool Group. There were no flickering streetlights or thin walls here, only the soft hum of a high-end HVAC system and the sight of Aunt Dorothy standing in a kitchen that actually had working appliances, her face finally free of the gray shadow of exhaustion. But for Lynn, the true transformation happened back at the obsidian desk. Cha Kwang was a man of his word. On the 3rd day of her new life, Lynn found a package waiting for her in the private lounge. It wasn't a toy or a dress. It was a pristine, leather-bound volume of the Etymology of Lost Dialects, a book she had only ever seen in the locked cases of university libraries. Beside it lay a small, personalized tablet preloaded with every language program imaginable. There was no note, just the weight of the gift, a silent acknowledgement that her mind was her greatest weapon. An hour later, Kwang entered the room. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that hid his tattoos but couldn't mask the predatory stillness of his gait. He didn't tell her to stay in the corner. He didn't point toward the shadows. Instead, he pulled out a chair, a smaller, custom-made seat upholstered in the same black leather as his own, and placed it directly to his right at the massive conference table. "Sit," he commanded, though the word held a rare, gravelly warmth. Lynn climbed into the chair. From this height, the world looked different. She wasn't looking at the undersides of tables or the heels of men's boots. She was looking at the faces of the most powerful people in the city. When the doors opened and a group of nervous associates filed in, the room went silent. They looked at the Mafia boss, and then their eyes drifted to the small, sharp-eyed girl sitting by his side. They saw the way Kwang leaned toward her, his tattooed neck inclining as if she were the only person in the room whose opinion carried weight. Throughout the meeting, Lynn didn't just listen to the words. She listened to the breaths taken between them. She watched the way a man's pulse throbbed in his neck when he mentioned unforeseen costs, and she felt the exact moment the air in the room shifted from cooperation to greed. Near the end of the session, a man from a rival logistics firm made a grand promise about loyalty and shared profits. Kwang didn't respond. He simply turned his head slightly toward Lynn. She didn't have to say a word. She just gave a single, microscopic shake of her head. Kwang's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "The deal is dead," he stated, dismissing the stunned group with a wave of his hand. As the room cleared, Kwang looked down at Lynn. She was already opening her new textbook, her silver pen poised to take notes on the margin. She was no longer a ghost, and she was no longer hungry. She was the anchor in a sea of lies. "You're not afraid of them," Kwang noted, watching her. Lynn looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "They're just using words, Mr. Cha," she said softly in Korean. "And I know where all the words are hidden." Kwang nodded, a small, proud smirk touching his lips. He had given her a seat at the table, but Lynn knew the truth. She had built the chair herself, out of every silent hour she had spent learning to hear what the rest of the world chose to ignore. The little girl from the hallway was gone. The voice of the king had arrived.